Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 5, Side 2. The central problem of Romanesque and Gothic architecture was how to support the roof. Early Romanesque churches had wooden ceilings, usually of well-seasoned oak. Such timbers, if properly ventilated and yet guarded from damp, will last indefinitely. So the south transept of Winchester Cathedral still has its 11th century ceiling of wood. The disadvantage of such structures lay in the danger of fires, which, once ignited, were hard to reach. By the 12th century, nearly all major churches had ceilings of masonry. The weight of these roofs determined the evolution of medieval European architecture. Much of this weight had to be borne by the columns that flanked the nave. These had therefore to be strengthened or multiplied, and this was done by combining several columns into a cluster, or replacing them by massive piers of masonry. The column, cluster, or pier was crowned with a capital, perhaps also with an impost to provide a larger surface to bear the superincumbent weight. From each pier or column cluster rose a fan of masonry arches, a transverse arch thrown athwart the nave to the opposite pier, another transverse arch crossing over the aisle to a pier in the wall, two longitudinal arches to the next pier forward and the next to the rear, two diagonal arches connecting the pier with diagonally opposite piers across the nave, and perhaps two diagonal arches to diagonally opposite piers across the aisle. Usually each arch had its own individual support on the impost or capital of the pier. Better still, each might be continued in unbroken line to the ground to form a component of a column cluster or compound pier. The vertical effect so produced was among the fairest features of the Romanesque and Gothic styles. Each quadrangle of piers in nave or aisle constituted a bay, from which the arches rose in graceful inward curvature to form a section of the vault. Externally, this ceiling was covered by a gabled roof of wood, itself hidden and shielded by slate or tiles. The vault became the crowning achievement of medieval architecture. The principle of the arch allowed a greater space to be spanned than had been practical with timbered ceiling or architrave. The nave could now be widened to harmonize with greater length. The widened nave required for proportion a greater height. This allowed the raising of the level at which the arches sprang inward from piers or walls. And this further prolongation of the direct shaft again enhanced the breathtaking verticality of the cathedral lines. The vault became a clearer harmony when its groins, the lines where the masonry arches met, were edged with ribs of brick or stone. These ribs, in turn, led to a major improvement in structure and style. The masons learned to begin the vault by erecting one rib at a time on an easily movable centering or wooden frame. They filled in with light masonry, one at a time, the triangles between each pair of ribs. This thin web of masonry was made concave, thereby shifting most of its weight to the ribs, and the ribs were made strong to channel the downward pressure to specific points, the piers of nave or wall. The groined and ribbed vault became the distinctive feature of medieval architecture at its height. The problem of supporting the superstructure was further met by building the nave higher than the aisles. The roof of the aisle with the outer wall thus served as a buttress for the vault of the nave, and if the aisle itself was vaulted, its ribbed arches would channel half their weight inward to counter the outward pressure of the central vault at the weakest points of the nave supports. At the same time, that part of the nave which rose beyond the roofs of the aisles became a clerestory or clerestory, whose unimpeded windows would illuminate the nave. The aisles themselves were usually divided into 2 or 3 stories, of which the uppermost constituted a gallery, and the second a triforium, so called because as the arched spaces by which it faced the nave were normally divided by 2 columns into 3 doors. In Eastern churches, the women were expected to worship there, leaving the nave to the men. So, stage by stage, through 10 or 20 or 100 years, the cathedral rose, defying gravity to glorify God. When it was ready for use, it was dedicated in a ceremonious ritual that brought together high prelates and dignitaries, pilgrims and sightseers, and all the townsfolk except the village atheist. Years more would be spent in finishing exterior and interior, and adding 1,000 embellishments. For many centuries the people would read on its portals, windows, capitals, and walls the sculptured or painted history and legends of the faith, the story of the creation, the fall of man and the last judgment, the lives of the prophets and patriarchs, the sufferings and miracles of the saints, the moral allegories of the animal world, the dogmas of the theologians, even the abstractions of the philosophers, all would be there in a vast stone encyclopedia of Christianity. When he died, the good Christian would want to be buried near those walls where demons would be loath to roam. Generation after generation would come to pray in the cathedral. Generation after generation would file out from the church into the tombs. The grey cathedral would look upon their coming and their passing with the silent calm of stone, until, in the greatest death of all, the creed itself would die, and those sacred walls would be surrendered to omnivorous time, or be ravished to raise new temples to new gods. 2. Continental Romanesque, 1066 to 1200. We should misjudge the variety of Western architecture in the 12th and 13th centuries if we allowed the foregoing sketch of cathedral structure to stand as valid for all Latin Christendom. In Venice, the Byzantine influence continued. St. Mark's added ever new decorations, pinnacles, and spoils, but always in the manner of Constantinople crossed with that of Baghdad. Probably through Venice, perhaps through Genoa or Marseille, the Byzantine style of domes placed with pendentives upon a Greco-cruciform base entered France and appeared in the churches of Saint-Étienne and Saint-Front at Périgueux, and in the cathedrals of Cahors and Angoulême. In 1172, when Venice decided to restore and enlarge the palace of the Doges, she took a medley of styles, Roman, Lombard, Byzantine, Arabic, and united them in a masterpiece that Villehardouin in 1202 thought moule riche et beau, and which still remains the chief glory of the Grand Canal. No definition of an architectural style has ever escaped exceptions. The works of man, like those of nature, resent generalizations and flaunt their individuality in the face of every rule. Let us accept the round arch, thick walls and piers, narrow windows, attached buttresses or none, and predominantly horizontal lines as characterizing Romanesque, and let us keep an open mind for deviations. Almost a century after the foundation of its Duomo, Pisa commissioned Diotisalvi to erect a baptistry across a square from the cathedral in 1152. He adopted a circular plan, faced the structure with marble, disfigured it with blank arcades, encompassed it with colonnades, and crowned it with a dome that might have been perfect but for its conical cupola. Behind the cathedral, Bonanno of Pisa and William of Innsbruck raised the Leaning Tower as a campanile in 1174. It repeated the style of the cathedral facade, a series of superimposed Romanesque arcades, with the 8th story housing the bells. The tower sank on the south side after 3 stages had been built upon a foundation only 10 feet deep, and the architects tried to offset this by inclining the later stories toward the north. In a height of 179 feet, the tower now deviates 16.5 feet from the perpendicular, an increase of 1 foot between 1828 and 1910. Italian monks migrating into France, Germany, and England brought Romanesque fashions in their train. Perhaps because of them, most French monasteries were Romanesque, so that in France Romanesque has the second name of the monastic style. The Benedictines of Cluny built a magnificent abbey there from 1089 to 1131, with 4 side aisles, 7 towers, and such an array of zoological sculpture as roused St. Bernard's ire. In the cloisters, under the eyes of the monks who read, what do these ridiculous monsters seek to do? What do these unclean monkeys mean? These dragons, centaurs, tigers, and lions? These soldiers fighting? These hunting scenes? What business here have these creatures who are half beast and half man? We can see here several bodies under one head and several heads on one body. Here we observe a quadruped with the head of a serpent, there a fish with the head of a quadruped. Here an animal is a horse in front and a goat behind. The Abbey of Cluny was destroyed in the Jacquerie of the Revolution, but its architectural influence spread to its 2,000 affiliated monasteries. Southern France is still rich in Romanesque churches. The Roman tradition was strong there in art as in law, and long resisted the barbaric Gothic that came down from the north. Marble was rare in France, and the cathedrals atoned for lack of external brilliance by a profusion of sculpture. Startling in the churches of southern France is the expressionism of the statuary, the resolve to convey a feeling instead of copying a scene. So the figure of St. Peter on a portal of the Abbey of Moissac of 1150 with its tortured face and arachnid legs, must have aimed not so much to accentuate structural lines as to impress and terrify the imagination. That the sculptors deliberately distorted such figures appears from the minute realism of the foliage in the Moissac capitals. The best of these French Romanesque facades is the west portal of Saint-Trophime's at Arles from 1152, crowded with animals and saints. Spain raised a lordly Romanesque shrine in the church of Santiago de Compostela from 1078 to 1211, whose Portico de la Gloria contains the finest Romanesque sculpture in Europe. Coimbra, soon to be the university city of Portugal, built a handsome Romanesque cathedral in the 12th century. But it was in its more northern migrations that Romanesque reached its apogee. The Ile-de-France rejected it, but Normandy welcomed it. Its rough power accorded well with the people recently Viking and still buccaneers. As early as 1048, the Benedictine monks of Jumièges, near Rouen, built an abbey reputedly larger than any edifice that had been raised in Western Europe since Constantine. The Middle Ages, too, were proud of size. It was half destroyed by the fanatics of the Revolution, but its surviving facade and towers preserve a bold and virile design. There, indeed, was formed the Norman style of Romanesque, relying for its effect on mass and structural form rather than on ornament. In 1066, William the Conqueror, to expiate the sin of marrying Matilda of Flanders, provided funds for a church of Saint-Étienne at Caen, known as the Abbé aux Hommes, and Matilda, perhaps with like motives, financed there the church of La Trinité, known as the Abbé aux Dames. About 1135, in a restoration of the Abbé aux Hommes, each bay of the nave was divided with an extra column on each side, bound with a transverse arch. In this way, the usual quadrapartite became a sexpartite vault, a form that proved popular throughout the 12th century. From France, the Romanesque style passed into Flanders, raising a handsome cathedral at Tournai in 1066. And from Flanders, France, and Italy it entered Germany. Mainz had begun its cathedral in 1009, Trier in 1016, Speyer in 1030. These were rebuilt before 1300, still in the rounded style. Cologne built in this period the church of Saint Maria in Capitol, famous for its interior, and the church of Saint Maria, famous for its towers. Both buildings were destroyed in the Second World War. The Cathedral of Worms, dedicated in 1171 and restored in the 19th century, is still a monument of Rhenish Romanesque. These churches had an apse at each end, and cared little for sculptured facades. They adorned their exterior with colonnades, and buttressed the towers with slender turrets of very pleasing form. The non-German critic praises these Rhenish shrines with patriotic moderation, but they have a charming gemütlich beauty, quite in harmony with the inviting loveliness of the Rhine. 3. The Norman style in England, 1066 to 1200. When Edward the Confessor came to the throne in 1042, he brought with him many friends and ideas from the Normandy in which he had spent his youth. Westminster Abbey began in his reign as a Norman church with round arches and heavy walls. That structure was buried under the Gothic Abbey of 1245, but it inaugurated an architectural revolution. The rapid replacement of Saxon or Danish by Norman bishops ensured the triumph of the Norman style in England. The Conqueror and his successors lavished upon the bishops much of the wealth confiscated from Englishmen who had not appreciated conquest. The churches became instruments of mental pacification. Soon the Norman English bishops matched the Norman English nobles in wealth, and cathedrals and castles multiplied as allies in the conquered land. Nearly all tried to rival one another in sumptuous buildings in the Norman style, wrote William of Malmesbury, for the nobles felt that day lost which they had not celebrated with some deed of magnificence. Never had England seen such a frenzy of building. Norman English architecture was a variation of the Romanesque theme. It followed French exemplars in supporting the roof by round arches on fat piers and by heavy walls, though its ceilings were usually of wood. When the vault was of stone, the walls were from 8 to 10 feet thick. It was largely monastic and rose in out-of-the-way places rather than in cities. It used very little external statuary, fearing the effect of a damp climate, and even the capitals of the columns were simply or poorly carved. In sculpture, England never caught up with the continent. But not many towers could match the mighty structures that dominated the Norman castles, or guarded the facade, or covered the transept crossing of the Norman church. Hardly any ecclesiastical structure in England is still purely Romanesque. Most cathedrals underwent a Gothic lifting of arch and vault in the 13th century, and only the basic Norman form remains. In 1067, fire destroyed the old Cathedral of Canterbury. Lanfranc rebuilt it from 1070 to 1077 along the lines of his former Abbé aux Hommes at Caen. Nothing survives of Lanfranc's cathedral except a few patches of masonry where Becket fell. In 1096 to 1110, the priors Ernulf and Conrad built a new choir and crypt. They kept the round arch but channeled the strange to points supported by external buttresses. The transition to Gothic had begun. York Minster, built in 1075 on a Norman plan, disappeared in 1291 under a Gothic edifice. Lincoln Cathedral, originally Norman in 1075, was rebuilt in Gothic after the earthquake of 1185. But the two great towers and sumptuously carved portals of the west facade survived from the Norman church and reveal the skill and power of the older style. At Winchester, the transepts and crypt remain of the Norman Cathedral of 1181 to 1103. Bishop Walkellan built it to receive the flow of pilgrims to the tomb of St. Swithin. Walkellan appealed to his cousin the Conqueror for timber to roof the enormous nave. William agreed to let him take from Hempage Forest as much wood as he could cut in 3 days. Walkellan's flock cut down and carried off the entire forest in 72 hours. When the cathedral was finished, nearly all the abbots and bishops of England attended its consecration. We may readily imagine the competitive stimulus aroused by such an enormous edifice. Some echo of the scope of Norman building comes down to us when we note that St. Albans Abbey was begun in 1075, Ely Cathedral in 1081, Rochester in 1083, Worcester in 1084, Old St. Paul's in 1087, Gloucester in 1089, Durham in 1093, Norwich in 1096, Chichester in 1100, Tewkesbury in 1103, Exeter in 1112, Peterborough in 1116, Romsey Abbey in 1120, Fountains Abbey in 1140, St. David's in Wales in 1176. These are not names, they are masterpieces. Shame bows us at leaving them after a few hours or dismissing them in a line. All but one were later rebuilt or reclothed in Gothic. Durham is still predominantly Norman and remains the most impressive Romanesque structure in Europe. Durham is a little mining town of some 20,000 souls. At a turn of the river Wear, a rocky promontory rises. On that strategic elevation stands the gigantic mass of the cathedral, half Church of God, half castle against the Scots. Monks from the island of Lindisfarne, fleeing from Danish raiders, built a stone church there in 995. In 1093, its second Norman bishop, William of St. Carolaf, demolished this building and with incredible courage and mysterious wealth raised the present edifice. The work continued till 1195, so that the cathedral represents the aspiration and labor of 100 years. The lofty nave is Norman, with a double arcade of round arches resting on uncarved capitals and stout piers. The vault of Durham introduced to England two vital innovations. The groins were ribbed, helping to localize pressures, and the transverse arches were pointed, while the diagonals were round. If the transverse arches had been round, their crowns could not have reached the same height as the diagonals, which are longer, and the apex of the vault would have been a disturbingly uneven line. By lifting the crowns of the transverse arches to a point, they could be made to reach the desired height. This structural consideration, and no aesthetic aim, apparently fathered the most prominent feature of the Gothic style. In 1175, Bishop Pudsey added to the west end of Durham Cathedral an attractive porch or narthex, which for some unknown reason received the name of Galilee. Here, where lies the tomb of the Venerable Bede, the arches are round, but the slender columns approach the Gothic form. Early in the 13th century, the vault of the choir collapsed. In rebuilding it, the architects supported the nave arcade with flying buttresses hidden in the triforium. In 1240 to 1270, a chapel of the 9 altars was added to hold the remains of St. Cuthbert, and in that shrine the arches were pointed, and the transition to Gothic was complete. 4. The evolution of Gothic. Gothic architecture might be defined as a localization and balancing of structural strains, emphasizing vertical lines, ribbed vaults, and pointed forms. It evolved through the solution of mechanical problems set by ecclesiastical needs and artistic aspiration. Fear of fire led to vaults of stone or brick. Heavier ceilings necessitated thick walls and clumsy piers. The ubiquity of downward pressure limited window space. The thick walls shadowed the narrow windows, and the interior was left too dark for northern climes. The invention of the ribbed vault lessened the ceiling weight, allowed slenderer columns and localized strains. The concentration and balancing of pressures gave the building stability without heaviness. The localization of support through buttresses allowed longer windows in thinner walls. The windows offered inviting scope for the already existing art of stained glass. And the stone frames surmounting compound windows aroused the new art of pierced design or tracery. The arches of the vault became pointed to allow arches of uneven length to reach their crowns at an even height, and other arches and window forms became pointed to harmonize with the arches of the vault. Better ways of bearing pressure permitted higher naves. The towers and spires and pointed arches emphasized verticality of line and produced the soaring flight and buoyant grace of the Gothic style. All these together made the Gothic cathedral the supreme achievement and expression of the soul of man. But it is presumptuous to concentrate a century of architectural evolution into a paragraph. Some steps in the development invite calmer scrutiny. The problem of reconciling light grace with stable strength was better solved by Gothic than by any architecture before our time. And we do not know how long our own bold challenges to gravity will escape the leveling jealousy of the earth. Neither did the Gothic architect always succeed. Chartres is still without a crack, but the choir of Beauvais Cathedral crumbled 12 years after it was built. The essential feature of the Gothic style was the functional rib. The transverse and diagonal arch ribs rising from each bay of the nave united to form a light and graceful web upon which a thin vault of masonry could rest. Each bay of the nave became a structural unit, bearing the weight and thrusts brought down by the arches rising from its piers, and supported by counterpressures from the corresponding bays of the aisles, and by outer buttresses applied to the walls at the inward springing of each transverse arch. The buttress was an old device. Many pre-Gothic churches had pillars of masonry externally added at points of special strain. A flying buttress, however, carries a thrust or strain over open space to a base support and to the ground. Some Norman cathedrals used half-arches in the triforium to prop up the arches of the nave. But such internal buttresses reached the nave wall at too low a point and gave no strength to the clerestory, where the explosive pressure of the vault was most intense. To apply support at this high point, it was necessary to take the buttress out of its hiding place, let it rise from the solid ground, and throw it through open space over the aisle roof to directly sustain the clerestory wall. The earliest known use of such an external flying buttress was in the Cathedral of Noyon, about 1150. By the end of that century it had become a favorite device. It had serious faults. Sometimes it gave the impression of a structural skeleton, a scaffolding negligently unremoved, or the makeshift afterthought of a designer whose building sagged. The cathedral had crutches, said Michelet. The Renaissance would reject the flying buttress as an unsightly obstruction and would support by other means such burdens as St. Peter's Dome. The Gothic architect thought differently. He liked to expose the lines and mechanisms of his art. He developed a fondness for buttresses and perhaps multiplied them beyond need. He compounded them so that they would give support at two or more points, or to one another. He beautified their stabilizing piers with pinnacles, and sometimes, as at Reims, he provided that at least one angel could stand on the point of a pinnacle. The balancing of strains was far more vital to Gothic than the ogive or pointed arch, but this became the outward and visible sign of an inward grace. The pointed arch was a very old form. At Diyarbakir in Turkey it appears on a Roman colonnade of uncertain date. The earliest dated example is at Qasr ibn Wardan in Syria in 561. The form is found in the Dome of the Rock and the Mosque of El-Aqsa at Jerusalem in the 7th century. On a Nilometer in Egypt in 861, in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun at Cairo in 879. It was in frequent use among Persians, Arabs, Copts, and Moors before its first appearance in Western Europe in the second half of the 11th century. It may have come to southern France from Moslem Spain or through pilgrims returning from the East, or it may have arisen spontaneously in the West to meet mechanical problems in architectural design. It should be noted, however, that the problem of bringing arches of uneven length to an even crown could be solved without the ogive by stilting the shorter arches, that is, raising their point of inward springing from pier or wall. This, too, had an aesthetic effect, as emphasizing vertical lines, and the device was widely adopted, seldom as a substitute for the pointed arch, often as a helpful accompaniment. The ogive solved a further problem. Since the aisles were narrower than the nave, an aisle bay had more length than width, and the crowns of its transverse arches would fall far short of those of its diagonals, unless the transverse arches were either pointed or stilted so high as to prevent their harmonious inward movement with the diagonals. The ogive offered a similar solution for the difficult task of vaulting with arches of even crown, the ambulatory of the apse, where the outer wall was longer than the inner, and each bay formed a trapezoid whose vault could not be forgivably designed without the pointed arch. That this was not at first chosen for its grace appears from the large number of buildings in which it was used to meet these problems, while the round arch continued to be used in windows and portals. Gradually, the vertical lift of the ogive, and perhaps a desire for harmonized form, gave the pointed arch the victory. The 90 years of struggle between the round and the pointed arch, from the appearance of the ogive in the Romanesque Cathedral of Durham in 1104 to the final building of Chartres in 1194, constitute in French Gothic the period of the transition style. The application of the pointed arch to windows created new problems, new solutions, and new charms. The channeling of strains through ribs from vault to piers, and from piers to specific points supported by buttresses, ended the need for thick walls. The space between each point of support and the next bore relatively little pressure. The wall there could be thinned, could even be removed. So large an opening could not be safely fitted with a single pane of glass. The space was therefore divided into 2 or more pointed windows, or lancets, surmounted by an arch of stone. In effect, the outer wall, like that of the nave, became a series of arches, an arcade. The 4-pointed shield of masonry left between the upper ends of the paired and pointed windows and the top of the enclosing stone arch made an ugly blank and cried out for decoration. About 1170, the architects of France responded with plate tracery. That is, they pierced the shield in such a way as to leave stone bars or mullions in ornamental designs, circular, cusped, or lobed, and they filled the interstices as well as the windows with stained glass. In the 13th century, the sculptors cut away more and more of the stone and inserted into the opening little bars of stone carved into cusps or other forms. This bar tracery took on ever more complex patterns, whose predominating lines gave names to styles and periods of Gothic architecture: lancet, geometrical, curvilinear, perpendicular, and flamboyant. Similar processes applied to wall surfaces over the portals produced the great rose windows, whose radiating tracery generated the term rayonnant for the style that began at Notre Dame in 1230 and reached perfection in Reims and Sainte-Chapelle. In the Gothic cathedral, only the soaring articulation of the vault transcends the beauty of the rose. Stone tracery, in the large sense of any piercing of stone in a decorative design, passed from the walls to other parts of the Gothic cathedral: the buttress pinnacles, the gables above the portals, the soffits and spandrels of arches, the triforium arcade, the sanctuary screen, the pulpit and reredos. For the Gothic sculptor, in the joy of his art, could scarcely touch a surface without adorning it. He crowded facades and cornices and towers with apostles, devils, and saints, with the saved and the damned. He cut his fancy into capitals, corbels, mouldings, lintels, frets, and jambs. He laughed in stone with the whimsical or terrifying animals that he invented as gargoyles, or little throats, to carry staining rain away from the walls or channel it into the ground through buttresses. Never elsewhere have wealth and skill, piety and lusty humor combined to provide such a feast of ornament as revels in the Gothic cathedral. Undeniably, the decoration was sometimes too profuse, the tracery was carried to a fragile excess, the statues and capitals must have been too gaudy with the paint that time has cleansed away. But these are the signs of a vital exuberance, to which almost any fault can be forgiven. Wandering in these jungles and gardens of stone, it dawns upon us that Gothic art, despite its heaven-pointing lines and spires, was an art that loved the earth. Amid these saints proclaiming the vanity of vanities and the terror of the judgment soon to come, we perceive the unseen but omnipresent medieval artisan, proud of his skill, joyful in his strength, laughing at theologies and philosophies, and drinking with relish and to the last drop the bubbling, brimming, lethal cup of life. 5. French Gothic, 1133 to 1300. Why did the Gothic Revolution begin and culminate in France? The Gothic style was not a virgin birth. 100 traditions joined in a fertilizing flow: Roman basilicas, arches, vaults, and clerestories, Byzantine themes of ornament, Armenian, Syrian, Persian, Egyptian, Arabic, ogives, groined vaults, and clustered piers, Moorish motifs and arabesques, Lombard ribbed vaults and facade towers, the Germanic flair for the humorous and grotesque. But why did these streams of influence converge in France? Italy, as in wealth and heritage the favored country of Western Europe, might have led the Gothic flowering, but she was the prisoner of her classic inheritance. Italy excepted, France was in the 12th century the richest, the most advanced nation of the West. She, above all others, had manned and financed the Crusades and profited from their cultural stimulus. She led Europe in education, literature, and philosophy, and her craftsmen were conceded to be the best this side of Byzantium. By the time of Philip Augustus, from 1180 to 1223, the royal power had triumphed over feudal disunity, and the affluence, power, and intellectual life of France were congregating in the king's own domain, that Ile-de-France, loosely definable as the region of the Middle Seine. Along the Seine, Oise, Marne, and Aisne, a fruitful commerce moved, leaving behind it a wealth that turned to stone in cathedrals at Paris, Saint-Denis, Senlis, Mantes, Noyon, Soissons, Laon, Amiens, and Reims. The manure of money had prepared the soil for the growth of art. The first masterpiece of the transition style was the magnificent abbey church of Saint-Denis, in the Paris suburb of that name. It was the work of one of the most complete and successful personalities in French history. Suger, possibly from 1081 to 1151, Benedictine abbot and regent of France, was a man of refined tastes who, while living simply, thought it no sin to love beautiful things and to gather them for the adornment of his church. If the ancient law, he replied to St. Bernard's criticisms, ordained that cups of gold should be used for libations and to receive the blood of rams, how much rather should we devote gold, precious stones, and the rarest of materials to vessels designed to hold the blood of our Lord? So he tells us proudly of the beauty and cost of the gold and silver, the jewels and enamels, the mosaics and stained windows, the rich vestments and vessels, which he gathered or had made for his church. In 1133 he brought together artists and artisans from all lands to raise and adorn a new home for France's patron Saint-Denis, and to house the tombs of the kings of France. He persuaded King Louis VII and the court to contribute the necessary funds. Following our example, he says, they took the rings from their fingers to pay for his costly designs. We picture him rising early to superintend the construction, from the felling of the trees that he chose for timbers to the installation of the stained glass, whose subjects he had selected and whose inscriptions he had composed. When he dedicated his edifice in 1144, 20 bishops officiated. The king, 2 queens, and hundreds of knights attended, and Suger might well have felt that he had won a crown more glorious than any king's. Of his church only parts remain in the present edifice: the west front, 2 bays of the nave, the chapels of the ambulatory, and the crypt. Most of the interior is a reconstruction by Pierre de Montereau between 1231 and 1281. The crypt is Romanesque. The west facade mingles round and pointed arches. Its sculptures, mostly from Suger's time, include 100 figures, many well individualized, and all centering about one of the best conceptions of Christ the Judge in the whole sweep of medieval art. 12 years after Suger's death, Bishop Maurice de Sully paid him the compliment of bettering his instruction, and Notre-Dame de Paris rose on an island in the Seine. Its chronology suggests the immensity of the task. The choir and transepts were built in 1163 to 1182, the nave in 1182 to 1196, the westernmost bays and the towers in 1218 to 1223. The cathedral was finished in 1235. In the original design, the triforium was to be Romanesque, but in the completion the whole structure adopted the Gothic style. The west front is unusually horizontal for a Gothic cathedral, but that is because the spires that were meant to top the towers were never built. Perhaps for that reason there is a firm and simple dignity in this facade that has led able students to rank it as the noblest architectural conception of man. The rose windows of Our Lady of Paris are masterpieces of bar tracery and coloring, but they were not meant to be described by words. The sculptures, though injured by time and revolution, represent the finest work in that art between the age of Constantine and the building of Reims Cathedral. In the tympanum over the main portal, the Last Judgment is carved with greater calm than in most later renderings of that ubiquitous theme. The Christ is a figure of quiet majesty, and the angel at his right is one of the triumphs of Gothic sculpture. Better still is La Vierge du Trumeau, the Virgin of the Pillar, on the north portal. Here is a new delicacy of treatment, finish of surface, naturalness of drapery, a new ease and grace of stance, with the weight on one foot and the body thereby freed from stiff verticality. In this lovely figure, Gothic sculpture almost declared its independence from architecture, and produced a masterpiece quite capable of being taken from its context and standing triumphantly alone. In Notre Dame at Paris, the transition was ended, and Gothic came of age. The story of Chartres illuminates the medieval scene and character. It was a small town 55 miles southwest of Paris, just outside the royal domain, a market for the plain of Beauce, the granary of France. But the Virgin was said to have visited the place in person. The pious lame or blind or sick or bereaved made it a goal of pilgrimage. Some were healed or comforted at her shrine. Chartres became a Lourdes. Furthermore, its Bishop Fulbert, a man mingled of goodness, intellect, and faith, made it in the 11th century a shrine of higher education, alma mater to some of the most brilliant figures in early scholastic philosophy. When Fulbert's 9th century cathedral burned down in 1020, he set himself at once to rebuild it, and lived long enough to see it finished. This, in turn, was destroyed by fire in 1134. Bishop Theodoric made the construction of a new cathedral a veritable crusade. He aroused such devotion to the task, financial and physical, that in 1144, according to the eyewitness account of Abbot Aymon of Normandy, kings, princes, mighty men of the world, puffed up with honors and riches, men and women of noble birth, bound bridles upon their proud and swollen necks, and submitted themselves to wagons, which, after the fashion of brute beasts, they dragged with loads of wine, corn, oil, lime, stones, beams, and other things necessary to sustain life or build churches. Moreover, as they draw the wagons, we may see this miracle, that although sometimes 1,000 men and women are bound in the traces, yet they go forward in such silence that no voice, no murmur is heard. When they pause on the way, no words are heard but confessions of guilt, with supplication and pure prayer. The priests preach peace, hatred is soothed, discord is driven away, debts are forgiven, unity is restored. This cathedral of Bishop Theodoric had hardly been completed in 1180 when, in 1194, fire gutted the nave, brought vault and walls to the ground, and left, as scarred survivors, only the subterranean crypt and the west facade with its 2 towers and spires. We are told that every house in the town was destroyed in that awful conflagration, whose traces are visible on the cathedral today. The discouraged people for a time lost faith in the Virgin, and wished to abandon the town. But the indomitable papal legate Melior told them that the calamity had been sent by God to punish their sins. He commanded them to rebuild their church and their homes. The clergy of the diocese contributed nearly all their income for 3 years. New miracles were reported of the Virgin of Chartres. Faith was rekindled. Multitudes came again, as in 1144, to help the paid workers pull the carts and set the stones. Funds were contributed by every cathedral in Europe. And by 1224, toil and hope completed the cathedral that makes Chartres again a goal of pilgrimage. The unknown architect had planned to top with towers not merely the flanks of the west front, but also the transept portals and the apse. Only the 2 facade towers were built. La Cloche-Vieux, the old bell tower, 1145 to 1170, rose with its spire to 351 feet at the south end of the facade. It is simple and unadorned, and wins the preference of professional architects. Its northern mate, the Clocher Neuf, twice lost its wooden spire by fire. The spire was rebuilt in stone from 1506 to 1512 by Jean Le Texier in flamboyant Gothic style of crowded and delicate ornament. Ferguson thought it the most beautifully designed spire on the continent of Europe. But it is generally agreed that so ornate a spire mars the unity of an austere facade. The fame of Chartres rests on its sculpture and its glass. In this palace of the Virgin live 10,000 carved or pictured personages, men, women, children, saints, devils, angels, and the persons of the Trinity. There are 2,000 statues in the portals alone. Additional statues stand against columns in the interior. Visitors who climb the 312 steps to the roof are astonished to see carefully carved life-sized figures where none but the vigorous curious can ever notice them. Over the central portal is a splendid Christ, not, as in later facades, sternly judging the dead, but seated in calm majesty amid a happy throng, his hand held out as if to bless the entering worshippers. Attached to the recessed orders of the portal arch are 19 prophets, kings, and queens. They are slender and stiff as befits their station as literally pillars of the church. Many are crude and unfinished, perhaps injured or worn. But some of the faces have the philosophic depth, the gentle repose, or the maiden grace that were to be perfected at Reims. The transept facades and porches are the fairest in Europe. Each has 3 portals, flanked and separated by beautifully carved columns and jambs, and almost covered with statues, every one of which is so individualized that several have received names from the folk of Chartres. The south porch centers its 783 figures around Christ enthroned on his judgment seat. Here, Notre Dame de Chartres is subordinated to her son, but in compensation she is endowed, as in Albertus Magnus, with all the sciences and philosophy, and in her service on this portal appear the 7 liberal arts. Pythagoras as music, Aristotle as dialectic, Cicero as rhetoric, Euclid as geometry, Nicomachus as arithmetic, Priscian as grammar, Ptolemy as astronomy. St. Louis, in the words of his charter of 1259, caused the north porch to be completed by reason of his particular devotion to the Church of Our Lady of Chartres, and for the saving of his soul and the souls of his forefathers. In 1793, the French Revolutionary Assembly defeated by a narrow margin a motion to destroy the statues of Chartres Cathedral in the name of philosophy and the Republic. Philosophy compromised by chopping off some of the hands. This north porch belongs to the Virgin, and tells her story with reverent affection. The statues here stand out in the round as fully matured sculpture. The drapery is as graceful and natural as any in Greek carving. The figure of modesty is French girlhood at its best, where modesty gives to beauty a double power. There is nothing finer in all the history of sculpture. These statues, said Henry Adams, are the Eugene marbles of French art. As one enters the cathedral, 4 impressions mingle. The simple lines of the nave and vault, hardly comparable in size or beauty with the nave of Amiens or Winchester. The ornate choir screen, begun in 1514 by the flamboyant Jean Le Texier, the peaceful figure of Christ on a pillar of the south transept, and, suffusing all with soft color, the unequaled stained glass. Here, in 174 windows, are 3,884 figures from legend and history, ranging from cobblers to kings. It is medieval France seen through the richest colors ever developed. Dark reds, soft blues, emerald greens, saffron, yellow, brown, white. Here, above all, is the glory of Chartres. We must not look to these windows for realistic portraiture. The figures are ungainly, sometimes absurd. Adam's head, in the medallion of the expulsion from Eden, is painfully askew, and the bilateral charms of Eve could hardly divert the worshipper to concupiscence. It seems to these artists enough that the pictures told a story, while the colors fused in the viewer's vision, and in their mingling painted the cathedral air. Excellent in design is the window of the prodigal son. Famous for color and line is the window of the symbolic tree of Jesse. But better than all the rest is Notre Dame de la Belle Verrière, Our Lady of the Beautiful Window. Tradition holds that this lovely panel was rescued from the fire of 1194. Standing at the crossing of transept and nave, one may see the major roses of Chartres. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.